10 years after he watched Lyra Ashbourne disappear into rain and mist, Cale Draconis stopped sleeping through a single full moon. It started small, a dream he couldn't quite hold onto by morning, just an impression of cold stone under his bare feet, and a voice that felt older than the mountains themselves. He told no one. A king who admitted to strange dreams. 10 years into a reign everyone still quietly measured against the scandal that had once nearly destroyed it, invited exactly the kind of scrutiny he'd spent a decade trying to avoid. The dreams grew worse, sharper. By the third month, he woke not with vague impressions but with entire scenes intact. Lyra's face in the rain, chains he'd allowed to be put back on her, a courtroom full of people who had believed a lie because he'd been too exhausted and too frightened to demand better proof before signing it into permanent fact. On the night of the 9th full moon, he didn't wake in his bed at all. He woke standing barefoot on an altar he had never seen before, carved from stones so old it had gone smooth and silver under centuries of moonlight, deep in ruins his own kingdom's oldest maps didn't bother to mark. Above him, the sky had gone the particular, impossible violet black of a night sky that existed nowhere in the waking world, and standing before him, tall and terrible and lit from within by something that made his eyes ache to look at directly, was a woman who was not a woman at all. "Alpha King Cale Draconis," she said, and her voice moved through the stone beneath his feet like something living. "You have carried this grief for 10 years and called it punishment enough. Who are you?" Cale asked, though some old, buried instinct already understood. "You know who I am," the moon goddess said. "You have prayed to me at every full moon of your reign, and never once, in 10 years, asked what your prayers actually cost the woman you were praying about." Cale fell to his knees on the cold stone. 10 years of carefully managed grief finally, catastrophically breaking open in front of a presence he understood could see through every careful excuse he had ever constructed for himself. "I am giving you one chance," the goddess said, "to find what you broke and to face it honestly, not as the man who ruled a kingdom, but as the man who let fear decide what love was worth. Whether you deserve forgiveness at the end of that journey is not mine to grant simply because you finally, belatedly asked for it." "What do I have to do?" Cale asked. "Walk," the goddess said, "and discover, at every step, exactly how much your 10 years of comfortable grief actually cost the woman who was never given the mercy of comfort at all." The decade following Lyra Ashbourne's exile had transformed Duskmoor into a kingdom that outsiders, judging only by its treasury and its trade agreements and its carefully mended relationship with the western villages, would have called a genuine success. Cale Draconis had governed with a diligence that bordered on penance, working through grief the only way he'd ever learned how, by making himself useful to something larger than his own devastation, one reform at a time, one council session at a time, one sleepless night at a time. He had never remarried. His council had stopped raising the subject somewhere around year 6, after enough refusals that even the most persistent among them understood the question had stopped being politics and become something closer to cruelty. He ruled alone, ate alone, and carried, in the private hours no advisor or steward ever witnessed, a grief that had calcified over 10 years into something he'd almost mistaken for peace. It wasn't peace. It was simply grief that had learned to hold still. The moon goddess had watched this decade unfold with a particular, patient attention old and powerful things bring to matters that mortals believe move too slowly to notice. She was not, whatever the oldest Duskmoor prayers still insisted, a gentle presence. She had bound wolves to their mates since the beginning of the world specifically because she understood, better than any mortal court or council, exactly how much devastation an unexamined heart could cause when it convinced itself that duty and love were natural enemies rather than two halves of the same obligation. Cale's decade of careful, competent governance had not gone unnoticed. Neither had the fact that every single year of it had been built, in some fundamental way, on the unexamined premise that grief alone constituted sufficient atonement, that suffering quietly, privately, for as long as he lived, somehow discharged the debt he owed to a woman he had never once, in 10 years, made any genuine attempt to actually find. The goddess had waited. She had let him build his careful monument of competent, grief-stricken rule for a full decade, understanding that a man who had not yet suffered the specific, targeted truth of what he'd actually cost someone else would simply keep mistaking his own pain for redemption, indefinitely, until someone or something forced him to look considerably more directly at the difference. 10 years was, by the accounting of something as old as the moon itself, a reasonable amount of patience to extend. It was time, finally, for the accounting to actually begin. She summoned him on the 9th full moon of that 10th year, to ruins that predated Duskmoor's own founding by centuries, sacred grounds scattered across the mountain territories to the north, half forgotten by a kingdom that had grown considerably more interested in trade routes than the old, demanding faith its earliest generations had once genuinely practiced. She did not intend to make his journey easy. Redemption, in her considerable, ancient experience, only ever meant anything when it cost the person seeking it something they could not simply purchase with sincere feeling alone. Cale woke, fully and finally, in his own bed just before dawn, soaked through with sweat, his bare feet, impossibly, carrying the cold, silvered dust of a stone floor that existed nowhere in his palace. He sat up slowly, heart still hammering with the particular, disorienting terror of a dream that had refused, this time, to fade politely into ordinary morning forgetfulness. He remembered every word. The goddess's voice still moved through his chest like something that hadn't finished speaking. "I am giving you one chance." He dressed in silence and summoned no one, understanding, with an instinct he couldn't fully name, that whatever had just happened belonged to him alone, at least for now, not something a council session or a careful royal announcement could properly hold. He found himself, an hour later, in the palace archive, pulling down old texts nobody had consulted in decades, the sacred geography of Duskmoor's earliest generations, maps drawn by priests who had believed, considerably more literally than anyone alive still did, that the moon goddess maintained physical ground where her presence remained strongest. He found the ruins marked on a map, so old its edges had crumbled to lace, a mountain territory 3 weeks' hard travel north of Duskmoor's own borders, labeled simply, in faded ink, the Silvered Steppes. "You're planning something," General Harwick observed, finding him still in the archive well past midnight, surrounded by texts and maps Cale hadn't touched in years of otherwise carefully organized rule. "I haven't seen you look this way since." He stopped himself, old careful discretion catching the sentence before it could finish itself. "Since the exile," Cale said, finishing it for him, because after 10 years, avoiding the word had stopped feeling like mercy and started feeling like its own particular cowardice. "I need to travel north, Harwick. 3 weeks, possibly more. I don't yet know exactly what I'm walking into. Your Majesty, the Council will require—" "I know what the Council will require," Cale said. "I'll give them whatever explanation satisfies them. I simply need you to understand, before I go, that this isn't a diplomatic mission, or a border inspection, or anything the Council would recognize as a legitimate use of a king's time." He met Harwick's steady, weathered gaze directly. "I had a vision. The moon goddess herself, on the last full moon. She's given me one chance to find Lyra, and to face what I actually did to her, honestly, rather than continuing to carry it the way I've carried it for 10 years, quietly, privately, and never once actually confronting it." Harwick was quiet for a long moment, old grief of his own. He had liked Lyra, genuinely, in the years she'd served under his command before the exile, moving visibly behind his careful composure. 10 years, he said finally, and you're only now going to look for her. I know, Kale said, the admission costing him something he understood. Even saying it aloud, he deserved to feel considerably more sharply than he had. I told myself, for 10 years, that searching would only be another cruelty, forcing her to be found by the same crown that once condemned her, rather than letting her keep the freedom she walked out to claim. I've had 10 years to believe that story about myself. I don't think it was ever entirely honest. What changed? I stopped being allowed to choose comfortable lies, Kale said, over the actual truth of what I did. He left 3 days later, alone except for a small, discreet escort Harwick insisted on despite Kale's initial resistance. Traveling north into mountain territory Duskmoor's maps had stopped bothering to properly maintain sometime in the last century. Toward ruins that existed, he understood with growing, uneasy certainty at the exact intersection of two things he had spent 10 years carefully, deliberately avoiding: the truth and the woman he had never actually earned the right to stop mourning quietly and start genuinely seeking. The journey north took considerably longer than the 3 weeks Kale's old maps had estimated, the mountain roads having fallen into the particular disrepair of paths nobody had needed to properly maintain in generations, bridges half collapsed, way stations abandoned and reclaimed by forest, the kind of slow, patient decay that happens when an entire kingdom decides, gradually and without ever formally announcing it, that certain sacred obligations simply aren't worth the trouble anymore. Kale found himself, on the 8th night of travel, camped alone at the edge of a ruined way station, his small escort having made camp a respectful distance away, understanding without needing to be told that whatever their king was carrying through these mountains required considerably more solitude than their usual formal duties allowed. He dreamed again that night, not the overwhelming, physical summoning of the first vision, but something quieter, more deliberate, like the goddess had decided a gentler reminder would serve better than another full confrontation. He stood, in the dream, in a village he didn't recognize, watching Lyra, considerably younger than she would be now, only perhaps a year removed from the exile, kneeling beside a makeshift birthing bed in a small, unfamiliar cottage, alone except for an elderly midwife whose face Kale couldn't quite focus on clearly. He watched her give birth to twins, a boy and a girl, both silent for one terrible, suspended moment before their first cries finally broke the tension in the room, and watched Lyra's exhausted, tear-streaked face as she held them both, alone, in a cottage he'd never seen, in a life he'd had no part in building. "You should have been there," the goddess's voice said, from somewhere beyond the dream's careful edges. Not because she needed you to be. She managed, as she has managed every single day since you signed that order. But because you deserve to understand, considerably sooner than tonight, exactly what your fear actually cost, not an abstraction. 2 children, born alone, into a world you had already convinced yourself couldn't hold space for their existence. Kale woke at dawn with tears he didn't bother trying to hide from his own small camp, understanding with devastating, permanent clarity that the children he'd suspected, distantly, painfully, for 10 years without ever letting himself properly confirm it, had genuinely, actually existed, had been born, real and specific and entirely without him, into a life he had forced their mother to build alone. "Your Majesty?" One of his escort, a young guard named Tomas, asked carefully, finding him still sitting motionless by the dead fire well past their usual departure time. "I have children," Kale said, the words feeling strange and enormous in his own mouth. 10 years of careful, unconfirmed suspicion finally, catastrophically given voice. "Somewhere. Twins. I don't know if they're even alive, Tomas. I don't know anything about them at all, except that they exist because of a woman I destroyed." Tomas, wisely, said nothing, simply helping his king to his feet and beginning, without being asked, to break down the camp for another day's difficult, uncertain travel north. They reached the Silvered Steps 11 days later than Kale's old maps had promised. A series of ancient, moon-white stone terraces cut into the mountainside, half swallowed by forest that had spent centuries slowly, patiently reclaiming ground the old faithful had once kept carefully clear. Kale climbed alone, leaving his escort at the base, understanding with growing certainty that whatever waited at the top required him to arrive without any protection beyond his own honest reckoning. The ruins at the top of the Silvered Steps consisted of a single, weathered altar, considerably smaller than the vast stone platform Kale had knelt on in his original vision, surrounded by the collapsed remains of what had once, centuries earlier, clearly been a proper temple. He wasn't alone when he arrived. An old woman sat on the altar steps, wrapped in furs against the mountain cold, her face carrying the particular, weathered dignity of someone who had spent considerable decades exactly where she currently sat. She watched him climb the final steps with an expression that gave away nothing at all. "You're later than she expected," the woman said, not rising. 10 years and 11 extra days, if my own counting's accurate. Though I suppose the goddess measures patience differently than the rest of us. "You know why I'm here," Kale said. "I've kept this altar for 40 years, the woman said. "I know why everyone who climbs these steps is here, eventually. Grief, mostly. Sometimes genuine repentance, though that's considerably rarer than the grief alone." She studied him carefully. "You're the king. Draconis. I recognize the crest, even worn as plain as you've traveled it." "I am." "Then you're here about the healer," the woman said, and something in her voice carried a weight Kale didn't yet understand. "The one who came through these mountains, 9 years back now. Pregnant when she first arrived, no, further along than that, actually. Already had the twins by the time she reached this particular altar, carrying them both in a sling her own 2 hands had clearly stitched together from whatever fabric she'd had available." Kale's chest tightened with a grief and hope so thoroughly tangled together he could no longer separate one from the other. "You met her," he said. "Lyra. You actually met her." "I gave her shelter," the woman confirmed. 3 nights, while she recovered from the mountain crossing. Strong woman. Considerably stronger than most who climb up here seeking the goddess's counsel. Most arrive already broken by whatever brought them. She arrived broken too, mind, but she'd already decided, by the time I met her, exactly what she intended to do about it. "Where did she go?" Kale asked, the question tearing out of him with a desperation 10 years of careful composure had never once allowed. The old woman studied him for a long, considering moment. "That's not mine to tell you, Your Majesty. Not because I don't know, I do or knew, at least, where she was headed when she left this altar. But the goddess was quite specific when she visited me in a dream some months back, warning me you'd eventually come climbing these steps. I meant to send you onward, not hand you the answer whole." "Onward where?" "To the village of Thornwick, 3 days east," the woman said. "Not because Lyra's there now. She left there years ago, from what little word still travels through these mountains. But because someone in Thornwick knew her, in those first difficult months, considerably better than I did in 3 brief nights of hospitality. If you want the truth of what your decision actually cost her, Your Majesty, I'd suggest you start earning it properly, one honest step at a time, rather than expecting the goddess to simply hand you the whole devastating accounting at once." Kale nodded slowly, understanding, with growing, uncomfortable clarity, exactly what kind of journey this was actually going to be. Not a single dramatic reunion, but a slow, deliberate unraveling of everything he'd spent 10 years avoiding looking at directly. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me yet," the old woman said, something almost gentle entering her weathered voice for the first time. "Thornwick's story isn't a kind one, Your Majesty. You should prepare yourself for that before you go any further." Thornwick turned out to be a small, hardscrabble settlement clinging to a mountain valley considerably less forgiving than the terrain Kale's own kingdom occupied. Thin soil, short growing seasons, a community that had clearly survived generations through stubborn, collective effort rather than any particular natural abundance. He found the village elder, a weathered woman named Brenna, who ran the settlement's single tavern, and asked, carefully, about a healer who might have passed through 9 years earlier, carrying twin infants. Something shifted in Brenna's expression, recognition, and beneath it, a wariness that made Kale's chest tighten with fresh, anticipatory dread. "You'd be the king then," Brenna said, studying him with an assessment that felt considerably less deferential than Kale had grown accustomed to in his own territory. "Draconis. She mentioned your name, once, though not kindly." "I understand," Kale said. "I have no right to expect kindness from her or from anyone who knew what happened." "No," Brenna agreed flatly. "You don't." She was quiet for a long moment, weighing something Kale couldn't read, before finally continuing. "She came here near winter, 9 years back, half-starved and carrying 2 infants who weren't doing much better than she was. We took her in. This village doesn't turn away a mother and 2 babies in that condition, whatever politics brought her to our door. She stayed the better part of a year, working as the village's healer, considerably more skilled than the woman we'd lost the previous spring." "What happened?" Kale asked, dread building steadily. "Winter fever," Brenna said, her voice going flat and careful in the particular way people speak about grief they've had considerable practice managing. "Bad year for it 9 years back. Took considerable numbers of us, young and old both. Lyra worked herself half to death trying to save everyone she could, and mostly succeeded, mind. She was that skilled. But the fever took the boy anyway. Her son, 3 months old. Nothing she did, nothing anyone could have done, made a difference in the end." Kale felt the ground shift beneath him. 10 years of carefully managed grief suddenly, catastrophically insufficient against a truth he had never once let himself properly imagine. "He died," he said, the words barely making it past his own throat. "My son. He died, and I never even knew he existed until 11 days ago." "She buried him herself," Brenna continued, relentless in the particular way that people telling a hard truth sometimes become, understanding that softening it now would only prolong the actual reckoning. "Refuse help from anyone in the village, dug the grave with her own hands in ground still half-frozen. Stood over it 3 days straight, from what I remember, before she'd let herself be moved back indoors." "And the girl?" Kale managed. "My daughter?" "Lived," Brenna said, something marginally softer entering her voice. "Strong little thing, even as a babe. Lyra named her Wren. Raised her here another 2 years, before she decided the memories in this particular valley had grown too heavy to keep carrying, and moved on somewhere else." "Where?" Kale asked. "I don't rightly know," Brenna admitted. "She never said, and I never asked. Some grief, Your Majesty, deserves the dignity of not being tracked down and questioned about its exact geography." Kale sat down heavily on the tavern's rough wooden bench, the full, devastating weight of everything he'd just learned settling into his chest with a permanence that made 10 years of careful, managed guilt feel, suddenly, almost obscenely insufficient by comparison. "I need to find her," he said, though the words came out considerably less certain than they had at the beginning of this journey. "Not to reclaim anything. I understand, now, that I have no right to reclaim anything at all. Just to understand. To finally properly understand what I actually did." Brenna studied him for a long moment, old grief, and something that might have been reluctant, hard-won sympathy moving behind her weathered features. "There's a healer's guild forming these past few years further east," she said finally. "Word reaches us occasionally from traveling merchants. A woman running it, From what's been described, skilled, particular about training only the genuinely dedicated, considerable reputation building across 3 separate territories now. She met his eyes directly. I don't know for certain it's her, but it sounds like the kind of thing a woman like Lyra Ashbourne might build, given 9 years and considerable reason to make something meaningful out of everything she'd survived. Cale didn't sleep properly for 3 nights after leaving Thornwick, grief for a son he'd never known consuming most of the quiet hours his small escort spent maintaining camp around him. On the 4th night, the goddess came to him again, not the overwhelming vision of the first summoning, but something considerably more intimate and considerably more devastating, a dream that placed him directly into a moment he had no right to witness and no ability to change. He stood in a small, frozen graveyard, watching a scene he understood, with dawning horror, was not simply symbolic. Lyra, considerably younger, kneeling in half-frozen ground, digging with her own bare hands exactly as Brenna had described, her infant daughter wrapped and sleeping nearby, while she buried a son Cale would never once get the chance to properly meet. "You wanted the truth," the goddess's voice said, moving through the frozen air of the dream like something with genuine weight. "Here it is in full. Not the abstraction you've carried for 10 years. The actual cost." "I can't watch this," Cale said, though the dream gave him no genuine choice in the matter. "You couldn't watch it happen," the goddess said, "because you weren't there. That absence is precisely what you're being asked to witness now, however late, however insufficient the witnessing arrives." He watched Lyra finish the grave, watched her lay her son to rest with a tenderness and devastation that made Cale's own chest feel like it was being methodically, deliberately broken open. He watched her stand, exhausted, over the small mound of frozen earth, and speak, quiet, private words he understood, even in the dream. He had no right to properly hear, and yet the goddess allowed him to anyway, forcing the reckoning she had promised him from the very beginning. "He'll never know his father chose a throne over him before he was even born," Lyra said, to the grave, to the mountain silence, to nobody who could actually hear her. "I suppose that's a mercy, in its own terrible way." He never had the chance to be disappointed by it. Cale woke with a sound he didn't recognize as his own voice, something between a sob and a scream, and found his small escort already awake, alarmed, gathered near his tent with careful, worried expressions. "Your Majesty," Tomas said carefully, "you were shouting." "I saw her," Cale said, voice raw. "Burying our son." "I heard what she said," standing over his grave. He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes, 10 years of careful composure entirely, permanently shattered. "She was right, Tomas. He never had the chance to be disappointed by me. That's the only mercy in any of this." He didn't sleep again that night, sitting instead at the dying edge of his own camp's fire, understanding with a clarity that felt considerably more permanent than any grief he'd carried across the previous decade, that the journey he'd begun 11 days into an overdue search was not, in fact, a journey toward reunion at all. It was a journey toward properly, finally understanding exactly what he had actually forfeited 10 years earlier, in a war room lit by torchlight, signing an order he had never once, in the moment, allowed himself to consider might cost this much. The Healers Guild, when Cale and his exhausted escort finally located it after another 2 weeks of careful, determined travel, occupied a modest complex of buildings on the outskirts of a prosperous eastern border town, considerably more established than Brenna's uncertain description had suggested, its reputation apparently having grown into something genuinely, widely respected across 3 separate territories. Cale stood at the edge of the guild's central training yard, watching a woman instruct a cluster of young apprentices in careful, precise wound-binding technique, and felt his entire chest go tight with a recognition that 10 years of grief hadn't managed to dull in the slightest. Lyra had changed. Considerably older now, of course. 32. He calculated, though the number felt strange against the 22-year-old woman he'd last watched walk through rain into permanent exile. Her hair, once worn loose and practical for battlefield service, was pulled back now in the careful, efficient style of someone who spent her days teaching rather than fighting. Her expression, watching her correct a young apprentice's technique with patient, exacting precision, carried an authority and settled confidence that the woman he'd once known, capable as she'd always been, had never quite fully possessed. She looked, Cale understood watching her, considerably more whole than he did, a woman who had built something genuinely hers out of the wreckage he'd forced her into, rather than a woman who had simply survived it. He didn't approach immediately. He stood at the yard's edge for the better part of an hour, watching her work, understanding with growing, uncomfortable clarity that whatever came next needed considerably more care than simply walking up and announcing himself. It was a young girl, perhaps 9 years old, dark-haired, with an intensity of focus that struck Cale with sudden, devastating recognition, who noticed him first, tugging at Lyra's sleeve and pointing toward the yard's edge with the particular directness of a child who hadn't yet learned to filter observation through adult politeness. "Mama, that man's been watching for a long time." Lyra turned, and Cale watched her entire body go rigid with a shock that mirrored, precisely, the devastating recognition moving through his own chest. "Cale." His name came out of her flat, disbelieving. 10 years of careful distance suddenly, catastrophically collapsed by a single unexpected reunion neither of them had properly prepared for. "Lyra." He didn't move closer, understanding with hard-won instinct, from 3 weeks of witnessing exactly how much his absence had cost her, that closing the distance himself would be exactly the wrong choice to make right now. "I'm not here to disrupt your life. I need you to understand that clearly before anything else." Lyra's expression cycled rapidly through shock, fury, and something considerably more guarded, settling finally into a controlled, careful wariness that Cale understood, with fresh grief, he had entirely earned. "Then why are you here at all?" she said. "After 10 years?" "The moon goddess," Cale said. "She summoned me, on the last full moon, gave me one chance to find what I destroyed, and to face the actual truth of it, rather than continuing to carry it quietly and privately the way I have for 10 years. His voice broke slightly on the next words. "I know about the boy, Lyra. I found Brenna, in Thornwick. I know what happened. I know I have no right to any part of this, but I needed you to know that I finally, properly understand." Something in Lyra's carefully controlled expression cracked, old grief surfacing despite 10 years of practiced composure. "You're 10 years too late to understand anything useful," she said, though her voice carried considerably more devastation than fury now. "Our son is dead, Cale. He's been dead 9 years. You showing up now, understanding it properly, doesn't change a single thing about that." "I know," Cale said quietly. "I'm not here expecting it to. I'm here because the goddess made clear that showing up, finally, honestly, mattered, regardless of what it does or doesn't change about what already happened." The young girl, Ren, watched this entire exchange with growing, careful curiosity, glancing between her mother and the stranger with an intensity that suggested she understood, on some instinctive level, exactly how significant this particular conversation actually was. "Is he my father?" she asked finally, directly, the same uncomplicated bluntness that had first drawn Cale's attention. Lyra's breath caught. Cale felt his own chest tighten with an emotion too large and too complicated to properly name. "Yes," Cale said, before Lyra could decide how to answer, understanding this particular truth belonged to him to speak, whatever else he had no right to claim. "I am. I'm sorry it's taken me 9 years to say that to you directly." Lyra allowed him to stay in the town, not in the guild itself, but at a modest inn nearby, for exactly 3 days, under terms she made unmistakably clear the first evening, once Ren had been settled with one of the senior apprentices for the night. "You don't get to simply reappear and expect reconciliation," she said, standing in the guild's now-empty training yard, arms crossed, 10 years of careful distance evident in every line of her posture. "Whatever the goddess told you, whatever journey you've been on these past weeks, none of that erases what actually happened, Kale. None of it brings our son back." "I understand that," Kale said. "I'm not asking for reconciliation. I don't think I have any right to ask for that at all." "Then what are you actually asking for?" Kale considered the question carefully, understanding it mattered considerably more than any answer he might have offered a month earlier, before 3 weeks of devastating discovery had properly reshaped his understanding of what he actually owed her. "Nothing," he said finally. "I'm not here to ask for anything, Lyra. I'm here because the truth required me to actually witness what my decision cost you, rather than continuing to imagine it safely from a distance.
I've done that now."
"I understand, considerably more thoroughly than I did a month ago, exactly what I destroyed." He paused. "If you want me to leave after these 3 days, I will. Whatever you decide about my presence going forward, I'll respect it entirely, without argument." Lyra studied him for a long, considering moment, old fury and something considerably more complicated moving behind her careful composure. "I built this," she said finally, gesturing at the guild around them. "Out of nothing. 9 years, Kale. I trained as a healer properly, formally, in a way I never had the chance to while I was serving your military. I built a reputation across 3 territories, entirely on my own merit, without a single connection to Duskmoor's crown to smooth the way for me. I raised Ren alone, grieved our son alone, buried him alone, rebuilt an entire life alone, because the man who should have shared any of it chose a war council's political panic over trusting 6 years of genuine partnership." "I know," Kale said quietly. "I've spent 3 weeks learning exactly how thoroughly I failed to earn any right to any part of what you've built since." "Then you understand," Lyra said, "why I can't simply hand you access to it now, because you've finally, belatedly done the work of properly grieving what you cost me." "I don't expect access," Kale said. "I expect to have earned nothing at all, beyond the simple fact of having finally shown up honestly, considerably too late to matter to the parts of this that already happened." They walked the guild's grounds in careful, mostly silent company for the remainder of that first evening, Lyra gradually, cautiously sharing pieces of the 9 years Kale had missed, the guild's founding 3 years earlier, from a single small clinic in a border town that had needed a healer badly enough to overlook her lack of formal noble sponsorship. The careful, patient work of training apprentices skilled and dedicated enough to eventually spread her methods across considerable distance. Ren's own early aptitude for the work, considerably more advanced already than most children twice her age. "She's remarkable," Kale said, watching Ren the following morning, assisting an older apprentice with genuine, focused competence despite her young age. "She is," Lyra agreed, something genuinely warm entering her voice for the first time since Kale's arrival. "She asks about you sometimes." "I never lied to her about your existence, Kale. Only about the reasons behind your absence, until she was old enough to understand something closer to the actual truth." "What did you tell her?" "That her father made a terrible mistake, out of fear rather than cruelty, and that mistakes like that sometimes cost considerably more than the person making them ever properly understands until it's far too late to fix," Lyra said. "I didn't want her growing up believing herself unwanted. Just inherited by someone who'd failed considerably before she was ever born." Kale absorbed this with fresh, complicated grief. "Thank you," he said, "for not letting her hate me before she'd had the chance to properly know anything true about it." "I didn't do it for you," Lyra said, though something in her tone had softened, marginally, over the course of the conversation. I did it because Ren deserved the truth, considerably more than she deserved a story built entirely to protect my own anger. Lyra allowed him to stay in the town, not in the guild itself, but at a modest inn nearby, for exactly 3 days, under terms she made unmistakably clear the first evening, once Ren had been settled with one of the senior apprentices for the night. "You don't get to simply reappear and expect reconciliation," she said, standing in the guild's now-empty training yard, arms crossed, 10 years of careful distance evident in every line of her posture. "Whatever the goddess told you, whatever journey you've been on these past weeks, none of that erases what actually happened, Kale. None of it brings our son back." "I understand that," Kale said. "I'm not asking for reconciliation. I don't think I have any right to ask for that at all." "Then what are you actually asking for?" Kale considered the question carefully, understanding it mattered considerably more than any answer he might have offered a month earlier, before 3 weeks of devastating discovery had properly reshaped his understanding of what he actually owed her. "Nothing," he said finally. "I'm not here to ask for anything, Lyra. I'm here because the truth required me to actually witness what my decision cost you, rather than continuing to imagine it safely from a distance.
I've done that now.
I understand, considerably more thoroughly than I did a month ago, exactly what I destroyed."
He paused.
"If you want me to leave after these 3 days, I will. Whatever you decide about my presence going forward, I'll respect it entirely, without argument." Lyra studied him for a long, considering moment, old fury, and something considerably more complicated moving behind her careful composure. "I built this," she said finally, gesturing at the guild around them, "out of nothing. 9 years, Kale. I trained as a healer properly, formally, in a way I never had the chance to while I was serving your military. I built a reputation across 3 territories, entirely on my own merit, without a single connection to Duskmoor's crown to smooth the way for me. I raised Ren alone, grieved our son alone, buried him alone, rebuilt an entire life alone, because the man who should have shared any of it chose a war council's political panic over trusting 6 years of genuine partnership." "I know," Kale said quietly. "I've spent 3 weeks learning exactly how thoroughly I failed to earn any right to any part of what you've built since." "Then you understand," Lyra said, "why I can't simply hand you access to it now, because you've finally, belatedly done the work of properly grieving what you cost me." "I don't expect access," Kale said. "I expect to have earned nothing at all, beyond the simple fact of having finally shown up honestly, considerably too late to matter to the parts of this that already happened." They walked the guild's grounds in careful, mostly silent company for the remainder of that first evening, Lyra gradually, cautiously sharing pieces of the 9 years Kale had missed, the guild's founding 3 years earlier, from a single small clinic in a border town that had needed a healer badly enough to overlook her lack of formal noble sponsorship. The careful, patient work of training apprentices skilled and dedicated enough to eventually spread her methods across considerable distance. Ren's own early aptitude for the work, considerably more advanced already than most children twice her age. "She's remarkable," Kale said, watching Ren the following morning, assisting an older apprentice with genuine, focused competence despite her young age. "She is," Lyra agreed, something genuinely warm entering her voice for the first time since Kale's arrival. "She asks about you sometimes." "I never lied to her about your existence, Kale, only about the reasons behind your absence, until she was old enough to understand something closer to the actual truth." "What did you tell her?" "That her father made a terrible mistake, out of fear rather than cruelty, and that mistakes like that sometimes cost considerably more than the person making them ever properly understands until it's far too late to fix," Lyra said. "I didn't want her growing up believing herself unwanted, just inherited by someone who'd failed considerably before she was ever born." Kale absorbed this with fresh, complicated grief. "Thank you," he said, for not letting her hate me before she'd had the chance to properly know anything true about it. I didn't do it for you, Lyra said, though something in her tone had softened marginally over the course of the conversation. I did it because Ren deserved the truth, considerably more than she deserved a story built entirely to protect my own anger. Ren found Kale alone on the second evening, sitting on a low wall at the guild's edge, watching the sun set over territory considerably more prosperous than the border villages he'd passed through weeks earlier. "Can I sit?" she asked, with a directness Kale was beginning to understand was entirely characteristic. "Of course." She settled beside him, quiet for a moment, studying him with the same intense, unfiltered focus he'd noticed the first evening. "Mom says you made a mistake," she said finally. "A big one. Before I was born." "I did," Kale confirmed, understanding this particular conversation required considerably more honesty than careful, protective phrasing. "I chose to believe something untrue about your mother because I was frightened and exhausted and surrounded by people who wanted me to believe it. I sent her away before I properly understood I was wrong. I never got the chance to know you were coming." "I had a brother," Ren said, quiet now, some of her earlier directness giving way to something more careful. "He died before I really knew him. Mom doesn't talk about him much. I think it still hurts too much." "I know," Kale said, his own voice unsteady. "I only learned about him myself 3 weeks ago. I'm so sorry, Ren. I'm sorry I wasn't there for any of it. Not for him, not for you, not for your mother when she needed considerably more support than I ever gave her." Ren considered this seriously, with the particular gravity children sometimes bring to conversations adults expect them to be too young to properly understand. "Are you going to stay now?" she asked. Kale felt the question land with considerable, devastating weight. "I don't know," he admitted honestly. "That's not entirely my decision to make, Ren. Your mother has built a whole life here, one she built entirely without me, and I don't have any right to simply walk into it and expect to belong." "But you want to stay," Ren said. "Not quite a question. I want the chance to know you," Kale said carefully. "Properly over time if your mother's willing to allow it. I don't expect that to look like simply moving in and becoming your father in every practical sense overnight. I expect it to take considerable patience and considerable trust one haven't earned yet." Ren nodded slowly, processing this with a seriousness that made Kale's chest ache with everything he'd missed across 9 years of her life he could never properly reclaim. "I think," she said finally, "that's probably the right answer. Mom says trust is something you build slowly, not something people should just hand out because someone finally shows up and says sorry." "Your mother is very wise," Kale said. "I know," Ren said, with the simple, uncomplicated confidence of a child who'd grown up entirely certain of her mother's competence. "She built this whole guild. Everyone here says so." They sat together a while longer, watching the sun finish setting, and Kale understood, sitting beside a daughter he'd known for exactly 2 days after 9 years of her entire existence, that whatever came next would require considerably more patience and considerably less certainty than any version of redemption he'd imagined during 3 weeks of difficult, revealing travel. On the morning of the third day, Lyra found Kale already packed, his small escort making final preparations for the journey back toward Duskmoor's borders. "You're leaving," she said, something in her voice Kale couldn't fully read. "You never asked me to stay," Kale said. "I understand considerably better now than 3 weeks ago that showing up honestly doesn't earn me the right to simply insert myself into a life you built entirely without me. I promised you 3 days, and respecting that boundary, without argument, seemed like the least I could offer after everything else." Lyra studied him for a long, considering moment, old grief, and something considerably more complicated moving behind her carefully guarded expression. "I'm not saying you can't ever return," she said finally, the admission clearly costing her something. I'm saying I need considerably more time than 3 days to decide what that would actually look like, going forward for Ren's sake and for my own. What you did cost us both something I don't think either of us will ever fully recover, whatever comes next. I understand, Kale said. I'm not asking for more than that. I only wanted you to know, genuinely, not as some performance meant to earn something from you, that I intend to keep showing up, honestly, for however long it takes you to decide whether that's actually welcome. Letters, if you'll accept them. Visits, if you're ever willing. Nothing forced, nothing demanded. And if I never decide it's welcome? Lyra asked, testing him with the directness Kale was beginning to understand ran in the family. Then I'll respect that too, Kale said, and meant it with a certainty that surprised even himself. I don't think I have the right to expect forgiveness simply because I finally, belatedly did the work of properly understanding what I cost you. Whatever you decide, Lyra, I intend to spend whatever years remain of my own life actually deserving whatever answer you eventually give me, rather than simply demanding it because a goddess sent me on a difficult journey. Something in Lyra's expression shifted. Not forgiveness, not yet, but perhaps the first small crack in 10 years of necessary, protective armor. Right to Ren, she said finally. Regularly, if you mean what you're saying. She deserves the chance to know her father, slowly and on her own terms, regardless of whatever happens between the two of us. I will, Kale said. I promise you that, without condition. Ren appeared at the guild's gate as Kale's escort finished their final preparations, watching the departure with an expression considerably more composed than Kale had expected from a 9-year-old saying goodbye to a father she'd known for exactly 3 days. You'll write? She asked, some careful hope evident beneath her composure. Every month, Kale promised. And I'll visit, whenever your mother allows it, however long that takes. Ren nodded, apparently satisfied by the promise's clear, unconditional terms, and Kale found himself, mounting his horse for the long journey back toward Duskmoor, understanding with a clarity that offered no easy comfort whatsoever exactly what the goddess's difficult, demanding chance had actually cost him to properly claim. Not reunion, not the neat, satisfying reconciliation he might once, foolishly, have hoped this journey would eventually produce. Simply the beginning, fragile, uncertain, entirely dependent on considerably more patient, honest work than 3 weeks of difficult travel had required, of a relationship he understood, riding south through mountain territory that had taught him more about genuine consequence than 10 years of careful, comfortable grief ever had. He would need to spend the remainder of his life actually earning one honest letter and one patient visit at a time. The moon goddess visited him one final time, that same night, in a dream considerably quieter than either of the two that had preceded it. Not an altar, not a demand, simply her voice, moving through the darkness of his own ordinary sleep. You found her, she said. You faced what you actually did, rather than continuing to carry it as comfortable, private grief. I did, Kale said in the dream, understanding this conversation carried a different weight than the ones before it. I don't think I earned forgiveness, though. She made that clear. No, the goddess agreed. You didn't earn it. Forgiveness isn't something a single difficult journey purchases, however genuine the suffering required to complete it. What you earned, Kale Draconis, is considerably smaller and considerably more honest than that. What did I earn? A chance, the goddess said. Nothing more than that. A daughter who knows the truth about you, rather than a comfortable fiction. A woman who understands, now that you finally properly grasp what your fear actually cost her, without that understanding obligating her to grant you anything in return. A path forward that exists, now, where none existed before, built on nothing but your own continued, patient willingness to actually deserve whatever comes next. Is that enough?
Kale asked.
After everything? I don't know, the goddess said, and something in her ancient, terrible voice carried, for the first time, something almost like genuine uncertainty of her own. "That's not mine to decide, Kale Draconis. It never was. Redemption isn't a reward I grant to those who suffer sufficiently to earn it. It's an opportunity one open, occasionally, to those who've finally stopped mistaking their own private grief for the actual work of making amends. What you build with that opportunity, whether Lyra ever chooses to let you fully back into the life you cost her, whether Ren grows to trust the father she barely knows, whether you spend the remainder of your reign actually deserving the small, fragile chance you've been given, all of that belongs entirely to you now." Kale woke at dawn, 3 days into his long journey home, understanding with a clarity that offered no easy comfort but considerable, hard-won honesty, exactly what the goddess's difficult gift had actually amounted to. Not a happy ending, delivered whole and complete because he'd finally suffered enough to deserve one. Simply a beginning. Fragile, uncertain, entirely dependent on years of patient, honest work he had no guarantee would ever fully succeed. A monthly letter to a daughter who might, eventually, come to genuinely know him. A woman who might, eventually, decide his continued honesty actually meant something beyond a single difficult journey, a chance, offered once, that he would spend however many years remained of his own life trying, imperfectly, and without any promise of success, to actually deserve. He rode south toward Duskmoor with that fragile chance held carefully and understood, watching the mountains gradually give way to more familiar territory, that whatever came next would require considerably more from him than any single act of redemption ever could. It would require him to keep showing up, honestly, patiently, for as long as it took, with no guarantee, ever, that it would be enough.
The end.